Hi everyone, this is Mark Webster from vSure, and today we'll be talking about temporary residents in Australia. How many are there? What types of visas do they hold? And what sort of work rights do they have? As well as what are the risks for employers who engage workers of each temporary visa category. So this chart just goes through the overall numbers of temporary residents in Australia. And I think the thing that surprises most people when they first look at a chart like this is the sheer number of temporary residents. There's over 2 million temporary residents in Australia, and this includes both people on temporary visas and people who are overstaying and don't have a visa at all. So let's have a look at each category and get a better understanding of how many there are and what sort of risks there are for the employers looking to engage these people as staff. First of all, we have the overstays. So the Department of Immigration estimates there are about 64,000 people in Australia who just don't have any type of visa. And they're usually people that have come to Australia on something like a visitor visa or a student visa, and they've just stayed longer than they're allowed to after their initial visa has expired. So these people, they've got no visa, no work rights. Employers should not go anywhere near these people. The next one we have is the visitor category, and there are about 300,000 visitors in Australia as of 30th of June 2018. Now, most visitors will just be here for tourist purposes, but there's also a business visitor stream. So the people here on business visitor visas are actually able to engage in business visitor activities. And so for employers, they need to be super careful about these staff who may come to Australia and say, look, I'm just visiting from an overseas office. I'm allowed to come to Australia and engage in business visitor activities. Whilst they do have a wider range of activities that's allowed on their visa than, say, a normal tourist, they still cannot work directly for an Australian employer. So people coming on business visitor visas still need to be carefully scrutinised in terms of what activities they're doing in Australia. So they can do things like come here for training, come here for conferences, come here to look at negotiating an employment contract, but employers should not directly engage them as employees. Next one we have here are bridging visa holders. So there are now over 176,000 bridging visa holders in Australia. And you may notice that that is actually more than the number of working holiday visas and the number of employer-sponsored visas. There are a huge number of people in Australia on bridging visas. So what is a bridging visa? Well, a bridging visa is a visa that lets somebody stay in Australia whilst a main visa application is being processed. So typically what happens is somebody will be in Australia on a temporary visa. They apply to extend onto another type of visa or to the same type of visa, and that processing may take several months, several weeks, or even several years. So whilst they're in Australia, if they've done the right thing and applied whilst their first visa was still in effect, they'll get what they call a bridging A visa, and that will allow them to stay in Australia during processing of their main application, even if that does take several years. So bridging visa holders often have work rights on their visas, but the problem is that if their main visa application is refused, they will generally need to depart Australia within 35 days. So they do need to be checked regularly to make sure that their status of their main application has not changed, but often they can work in Australia. And for instance, if somebody has applied for a partner visa, generally they can work full-time in Australia whilst they're waiting for their partner visa to be processed. And at the moment, a partner visa might take 2 years. So that person can work for an employer for that 2-year period whilst they're waiting for their main application to be processed. Next one we have is students. And international students actually make up 487,000 of the temporary visa holders in Australia at any given time. And that's a record high. So there are a large number of students in Australia, and they would generally have work rights. So the usual work rights condition for student visa holders is they can work 40 hours per fortnight during semester and full-time in semester break. Sometimes they can work full-time, particularly if they're doing a research qualification. And in terms of spouses of students, they can usually work as well. Either the 40 hours per fortnight rule or even in some cases working full-time. So students, there's a large number here. They are obviously a skilled group of people because they were looking at doing education here. But the thing about students you need to watch is that they can change status in Australia. So often students will move on to another type of visa, such as a graduate temporary visa or a bridging visa whilst they're waiting for the next application to come through. So employers should be checking student visas regularly. The other thing that can happen with students is that if they don't attend classes, their visas can be cancelled. And if you're the employer, there's no way that you would know that that has happened unless you're checking visas regularly. The next category we have is working holiday visas. Working holiday makers are a great source of staff for lots of Australian businesses. They are a large number of the temporary visa holders in Australia. There's 135,000 of those. But the main trick for employers is to look for the 6-month work limitation. So generally on a working holiday visa, you can only work for 6 months with each employer. So employers should be tracking the expiry date of that 6-month limitation to make sure they don't work more than the 6 months, as well as the expiry date of the visa itself. The next one we have are temporary graduate subclass 485 visas. These are international students that have finished their course in Australia. Generally, that would be a bachelor level qualification, and they can work full time. Usually the visa is valid for 2 years, but it might be valid for 3 years or 4 years, or in some cases 18 months, depending on the course that the student has done. So you do need to double check the expiry date. Usually the work rights will be there as full-time work rights, but the other thing you need to watch out for is change of status. So if a graduate temporary visa holder changes status onto a student visa, then their work rights will be diminished. So employers need to be checking that that hasn't happened and that they're not engaging somebody in breach of their visa conditions by mistake. We also have a wide range of other temporary visa types, and this is very much a mixed bag. There are a lot of different temporary visa types, and this could be anything from a training visa where somebody is doing on-the-job training for their full qualification, through to student guardians who will be parents of students who are studying in Australia and who are under 18. So it can go anywhere from there are limitations on the type of work they're doing through to no work, which is the case for student guardians. So for employers to get on top of all those different types of visas with all those different types of conditions can be difficult. So a lot of the visas you'll see will be the same, but every now and then you'll get one of these ones out of left field. They're quite interesting visas, but they can be quite complicated to understand in terms of what it does allow the holder to do in Australia. And then we have a range of provisional visas such as skilled regional visas, which are visas that are restricted to allowing the person to only work in specific areas of the country, and things like business provisional visas, which are where somebody has applied for business migration to Australia. Generally, they can work without restrictions. But we also have visas such as provisional partner visas, and they're interesting because they generally lead to permanent residence, and they do have full work rights in Australia, except when they don't. So what I mean by that is a partner provisional visa is a temporary visa that's granted whilst the person is waiting for their permanent partner visa. And if the permanent partner visa is refused, that will mean that the temporary partner visa also ceases. And that does unfortunately happen quite often, particularly when the relationship with the partner breaks down. So if the partner decides that the relationship has ended, what will generally happen is they report to the Department of Immigration, and that will fairly quickly result in the department refusing the permanent stage of the application with the result that the temporary visa ceases. So again, unless the employer is checking regularly, they won't know about that. And the next thing you know, that employee may be needing to hastily depart Australia. Most employers are quite familiar with the employer-sponsored visas, such as the 457 and the TSS, which has replaced it. And the thing to note here is that it's only now a small proportion of the overall temporary resident number in Australia. It's 147,000 of those in the country out of a total of 2.25 million. So they're barely getting to 5% of the overall numbers of temporary residents in Australia. So if you think that you're on top of your work rights obligations because you know that you only have a few 457 holders, think again, because the majority of your staff may well be people on one of these other types of visas. We also have a large number of New Zealand citizens in Australia. There's about 673,000 of those, and they can work full-time in Australia and stay as long as they want. The only thing is, even employing New Zealand citizens is no longer as secure as it used to be. In particular, there are a large number of New Zealand citizens that are now having their visas cancelled due to character concerns. And in fact, the largest number of people in detention are New Zealand citizens. So there you have it. These are the temporary resident types that we have in Australia. And obviously, because all of those are different with different conditions and different levels of risks, employers should really be taking different risk level approaches to those different types of visas. So Australian citizens, they're definitely the safest. So very difficult to lose your Australian citizenship status. If you cite their passport or their citizenship certificate or even a birth certificate showing they were born in Australia, that will generally be enough to meet your obligations as an employer. Permanent residents, similarly, you should probably check them once to make sure they really do have a permanent visa. Very difficult to lose permanent resident status, but it is possible actually. Two different ways that can happen. First of all, the permanent visa does allow them to stay here indefinitely, but the travel facility is only valid for up to 5 years. It can be shorter even. It can be as low as 1 year, depending on the circumstances of the person. So that's generally not an issue if they're in Australia working for you, but if they're doing a lot of travelling, they could actually lose their status. So I would certainly recommend for employers that they keep records of when the permanent visas expire so that they do know when the person travels that they'll be able to get back to Australia safely. New Zealand citizens, as I mentioned, are generally quite safe unless there's a character concern. Under the migration regulations, citing a New Zealand passport is sufficient evidence that they have work rights in Australia. But I would certainly recommend, given the prevalence of cancellations for New Zealand citizens, that it is prudent to also do a visa check for New Zealand citizens these days. For the 457 or temporary skills shortage visa, look, they're fairly safe in general because they're controlled by the employer. Generally, you'll be the one that's lodged the application. You'll know the expiry date. You'll know what the position is, what the visa lets them do. But the one thing to look out here is for dependents. So if somebody is a spouse who's dependent on a 457 or TSS, they can also work full time. The problem is that if the main visa holder loses their job or the relationship breaks down, then the dependent visa holder may face cancellation. And if you're not checking the status regularly for those dependent 457 or TSS holders, you won't know that. The other one is working holiday visas. Look, generally they're pretty safe. Just watch out for the 6-month limitation and watch out for changes of status. So if somebody's on a working holiday visa, they can work full time. But if they then change status onto a student visa, you may well find that they're limited to 40 hours a fortnight. So even though working holiday visas are fairly easy to understand, I would certainly recommend regular checks for those. Students, they can be really complicated, and with the visa condition or student visas, it's actually very hard to understand because no matter what course they're doing, they'll have the same visa condition, but their work rights will be different depending on what the course they're doing. So certainly worth it if you're an employer with a lot of students on staff to double check what course they're actually enrolled in and when it starts. If they're in a master's or a PhD, they may be able to work full time. If they're a dependent, again, you need to watch out for that because if the relationship breaks down or the main student stops attending classes, then that dependent can face cancellation too. And obviously, bridging visas, they would be the highest risk of all of the categories we've talked about, because the bridging visa's validity depends on there being an ongoing visa application that hasn't been decided yet. So I would certainly recommend checking visas once a month for bridging visa holders to make sure that they're still able to work for you. So let me talk a little bit about vSure. It's designed to make employers' life simple when it comes to visa compliance. So one of the best things that makes it easier for employers is that it makes the visa types easier to understand. So there are lots of different temporary visa types, as I've gone through today. When you do a check through Vivo, you don't get much information about the visa. You'll just get the class, which might be TU, and the subclass, which might be 500. But when you look at vSure, it gives you a lot of information about the visa, helps you understand what the person can do for you, and what conditions are on the visa as well. So we'll tell you that that's a student visa and it'll be valid for the duration of the course, and they can start working once the course has commenced in Australia. So it just gives you a bit of extra information over Vivo, makes it easier for you to know what's going on with the visas. But also with temporary visas, they all have different durations, and that can make tracking the visa expiries really complicated. So what we do is that we enable you to set up reminders about expiry dates. It can be via SMS, via email, or calendar reminders. It means that you just won't miss that expiry date. We'll keep on reminding you until the expiry date comes up, so there's no way you can miss that expiry date and have the person be unlawful. And the other thing that's really great is that you can set up an automated schedule to check visas every month or every fortnight or even every week. So that means that if somebody does change status, you'll know about it. And we do flag those people that change status so you can double check that they're still able to work for you in their original capacity. So that situation where somebody is on a bridging visa and they've had a refusal and they now need to depart Australia, you'll get an update about that. If there's a situation where somebody's on a working holiday and they've moved on to a student visa and therefore can't work full-time anymore, you'll get notice of that as well. And that's set up automatically, so you don't even have to think about it. You'll just get a report where the people that now have an issue are flagged for you to take the appropriate action. So how vSure works? Well, what you do is you import all of your employees' data onto our system, stored securely on the cloud, and then we can set up schedules to check the status of your staff through the Department of Immigration. We get that information directly from them. You know it's current, you know it's correct, and you can rely on that information. What you'll see is all of your current staff will have all of their visa statuses, expiry dates, visa conditions listed on a single page, and it's risk profiled so that the riskiest people are up the top and the ones that are of least risk are down the bottom, so that you're focusing on the right thing. Makes it really easy to identify issues and to keep everyone compliant. So if you'd like more information about how vSure can help you out to comply with the employer sanctions legislation, the best way is to give Matt an email, matt@vsure.com.au, and he can schedule a time to walk you through the system, talk to you about your specific requirements, and talk about how vSure will be able to help you make your life simple when it comes to visa compliance. So thanks for listening today, and looking forward to hearing from you.